Don't always trust what your eyes see. The Running by Alaborn. Read to you by Asher. Chapter 2. The Running, First Year. Each night, as Big Macintosh dreamed, he would dream of the same world, a world where he could not speak, but these strange bipeds could. He understood them. They spoke his language, even if he couldn't speak in return. And then there were bipeds. Both treated them the way he would treat the pigs, speaking in simple words, though with no expectations that he would understand. He was fed simple foods, hay and oats. He longed for more, such that when he was often an apple, even though he knew it was unfair, far in favor to the apples he grew each day, he pushed to the fore to claim the sweet treats. This was his alternate world. Bland food, running, and rest. There were many of these bipedal creatures. There were many who rode him, and though they were different, he grew to recognize the similarity of their commands. The same physical cruel would direct his movement, would alter his speed. He grew to recognize that the bipedals shared his desires to win the race. They positioned him to take a clear land in one race, and then placed him pacing the leader in another race, waiting for the leader to tire before making his move. It was a lesson learning anew, a lesson once learning running against other colts around the schoolyard. Other bipeds would care for him, brushing his coat, tending to his hooves. He didn't enjoy being cared for like a little foal, but looking at the adequates next to him, their dull expressions, he understood that he wasn't expected to care for himself. He imagined himself at Ponyville Spa that Fluttershy raved about. These bipeds understood his needs. Their farrier assured his hooves were protected against the running he did, and their doctors tended to even the slightest muscle strain. There was one biped in particular who was different. An older specimen of gray coloring in the hair was an indicator for age, like it was for ponies. He spoke to him, praising him, complimented his running form. The way he spoke, it was almost as if he expected that he would understand him. But then he wouldn't dart and speak to others as if Big Macintosh weren't there. Each night when he turned to sleep in the stable, Big Macintosh would then wake up first to the light of Celestia's sun and the familiar fragrance of Sweet Apple Acres apple trees. He would recall the feedings, remembering what it was like to spend all day working, develop his special talent. Then he would put those thoughts behind him. Sweet Apple Acres needed him. One day, things were different. Rather than being taken to the familiar dirt track, Big Macintosh was led into a metal container, maybe a little bit smaller than the train carriage. The interior was bare, unabandoned stalls with little but loose hay on the floor. That was something he had not considered. Here, the equies saw no need to sit. Instead, lay on the ground, or even resting while standing with their legs locked. Big Macintosh stepped into a stall. Seeing glimpses of the others, home thoughts, the narrow stalls on the container. There were no proper windows either. Then, the entire container shook, vibrating as he heard and felt something far louder than a train engine. His nostrils were assaulted by a foul stench, one that seemed to linger in the background of his world. but which now overwhelmed every other smell. Then he started to move. The vehicle moved as fast as a train, maybe faster, even though he couldn't spot any rails. They traveled for hours. How long it was, Big Macintosh didn't know. As he dozed off and on through the journey, finally, they stopped, and he was eager to get out to move and run. Big Macintosh saw some of the familiar bipeds. The Frere, the doctor, the small one who had often ridden him. But everything else seemed different. Was different. The equines were one he had met. They looked like the stallions he knew, with some build and obvious strength of their muscle frame. But he had to build up a familiarity with the equines he knew from his other home. It reminded Big Macintosh of being introduced to other ponies on the first day of school. He began to get nervous. As he was led out to the track, he focused on what the familiar act of running was, that he was born to do. But once there, he couldn't help but hear the noise. He was used to seeing these bipeds watch him run here. Here, there were many more. Too many bipeds to count. Too many even to estimate a count. The noise they made was deafening. His ears folded back, but it did not quell the sound. "Here, let me get this," one of the bipeds said, and something put on Big Macintosh's head. It covered his ears, muffling the noise somewhat, but it also restricted his vision. Having gotten used to the freakishly wide angle of vision of the Ediquet's body, being restricted to looking forward only worsened his panic. The familiar weight on the rider on his back calmed him slightly. "Calm down, boy," the rider said, patting his flank. "It's your first real race, but you'll do great." First real race? He tried again to focus on the familiar. The line of the stalls, each holding an equine with a door that would open to signal the start of a race. But he was not prepared for the noise that came with the race when the race started. The enormous crowd of bipeds roared louder than a manticore, and Big Macintosh jumped. He had trouble finding his hoofings in the dirt, and wasted several strides before he rose to a gallop. His rider didn't help, giving conflicting signals that failed to help him build his rhythm. He strained to reach full speed, and while he was able to get there with only one other equine ahead of him, he already felt winded. And it was the most basic lesson of running. He had forgotten it. Big Macintosh was further distracted by not being able to see. He couldn't finally hear the equines around him, but he wanted to see them to know how to react. The bipeds riding him had forward-facing eyes, like a pony, but he couldn't see behind them without turning his head. Except now he couldn't. He slipped further and further behind the leader as other equines outpassed him. In a longer race, like the running of the leaves, Big Macintosh was sure he could have caught up with these equines in front of him, but the race was short, and he crossed the finish line after 4 others. Big Macintosh bowed his head in shame. Back at his other home, Big Macintosh returned to his daily training. One such day was interrupted by an argument among several of the bipeds, which he picked up with his keen ears. "You should never have used that blinder," one said. It sounded like an older biped. "He was obviously bothered by the noise," another replied. "He was still bothered by wearing the blinder. And you didn't work with your mount." "I did my best, but he was excited." "This colt is the greatest runner I've ever seen. He moves with grace and precision. I need a jockey who can work with him." That was the same older biped. Later that day, Big Macintosh was ridden by a different one, but of smaller bipeds. They looked similar, with the same dull skin and color, but the same dark tuft of hair atop their heads, but he picked up on the different scent. As they raced, he realized this one felt right. For a second time, Big Macintosh boarded the plain metal container and endured a long trip to somewhere familiar yet unfamiliar. Here again, there were unfamiliar equines, a loud crowd of bipeds, and a dirt racetrack. This time, his courier stuffed something soft in his ears, cotton. He realized the cotton effectively muted the sound of the crowd, and it was noticeably calmer as he lined up on the track. He felt a comfortable pat on the withers. "Let's prove the boss right," the rider said. This time, Big Macintosh was ready for the gates to open. He charged forward, taking the early lead. He ate up a length of the track with his graceful strides. With a clear sense of the equines behind him, he sped up when they did, and shifted lanes to stop their attempts to overtake him. His rider shared his awareness of the track and was giving him the same signals, but he anticipated these commands. This time, Big Macintosh finished the race with a complete victory, just as he imagined his 10-year-old self would have done at the racing of the leaves. For the rest of the year, Big Macintosh raced, always with the same rider. He won his races. When he injured his hoof, the bipeds took care of him, putting a thin layer of some unknown metal on his hoof to protect it and his frog before nailing on his hoof shoes. Even with the protective horseshoe, his hoof pained him every time he tried to run. And that was it for the year. He raced no more. It was good timing, as they were approaching harvest and cider season, and Big Macintosh needed to focus on his life, his original life. His injury couldn't cross back to his original body, but he felt tingles of phantom pain as he bucked trees and ran the treadmill to power the cider press. Back in the other world of strange equines and bipeds, they worked to treat his injured hoof. The bipeds were positive, particularly the older biped. "You need to heal for next year," he said. "Then we will show the world how great of a runner you are." End of chapter 2.